We're now going to talk about vested interests that exist in the mental health world today. Now, it's a little bit harder to talk about this, to observe these vested interests, mainly because we have less of a vantage point. We're a lot closer to the world that we currently live in, obviously, as opposed to one from 200 years ago. However, we can observe certain things that I think are very important when considering the vested interest that may exist and the powerful forces that may influence how we understand mental health. So the two things are, one, enough power to shape the narrative around mental health. So, there are certain groups that are incredibly powerful that are able to influence how we even understand this stuff. And two, a vested interest to do so in a particular way. So not only do they have huge amounts of power that they could potentially use to influence how we understand mental health, they are going to want to do it in a particular way that's beneficial or profitable to them. What examples can we think of where all of this applies? First example I can think of are pharmaceutical corporations. Multi-billion-pound pharmaceutical corporations have a vested interest to look after their own profits. And this vested interest can result in them framing mental health difficulties purely in terms of broken brains and chemical imbalances, because this way of looking at it and explaining things lends itself to people taking their drugs on a very long-term basis and keeping their profits flowing. It's worth bearing in mind as a part of this, no test whatsoever exists to measure any such imbalance, and no psychiatric disorder has been evidenced to be linked with any single biochemical disturbance either. Despite this, this narrative is pushed out there on a very regular basis. This isn't to say that individual people who work for multi-billion-pound pharmaceutical corporations are deliberately lying. There may be very well-meaning people working for these organisations. Nevertheless, the way corporations work is that they need to be increasing the prices of their shares on a regular basis because they're owned ultimately by shareholders. Most people who are shareholders, most people who go out and buy shares in different organisations don't tend to be doing it because they're particularly attached to that organisation. Some do, but a lot do it because they think the share price will increase at some point in the future and they're going to make a profit on their investment. So the people that manage these organisations care about increasing their shares, and peddling a narrative that results in loads and loads and loads of people needing drugs all the time is massively profitable in that respect. And so these organisations are going to look at it purely in that way. Might not be deliberate, might not be conscious, but that vested interest is absolutely there if you ask me. In relation to the lack of biological markers, this isn't an outlandish idea. David Kupfer, who was literally the chair of the DSM-5 task force, so the DSM-5 stands for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders, which is kind of the textbook thing. It's literally a textbook of what mental health disorders are out there. He put this together and he admitted, in the future, we hope to be able to identify disorders using biological and genetic markers that provide precise diagnoses that can be delivered with complete reliability and validity, much in the same way as physical illness. Yet this promise, which we have anticipated since the 70s, remains disappointingly distant. We've been telling patients for several decades that we are waiting for biomarkers. We're still waiting. And that was written 12 years ago, and we are still waiting today. Nevertheless, this narrative is hammered out there because huge organisations have a lot of profit to be made from this narrative being put out there, despite whether or not it's true. Maybe people who work for these organisations, maybe some do think it's true, maybe. The massive vested interest, though, is, I think, likely to skew people's perspective on this, and certainly gets in the way of us being able to have a genuine conversation about things that is focused on what the truth of the matter is, rather than what profit can be made from it. Psychiatrist Joanna Moncrieff, who writes a lot about this, talks about how the chemical imbalance idea, despite there being no scientific basis for it, remains prevalent anyway, simply because of how often it's echoed by other people. So I'll read this out again. The message is repeated on numerous company websites, despite the fact that it cannot be clearly substantiated with scientific evidence. Information produced by professional bodies and charitable groups also promotes this view, and it's reported by the media as if it were established fact. This is how psychiatric knowledge has come to be distorted by commercial interests. If you have enough money to help fund charities, basically you have enough money to throw around everywhere, you can influence how people speak about these things. Money equals influence, essentially. And as important as the scientific process is to understanding all of this stuff, the scientific process can be circumvented if people have enough money to change how people even conceptualize the topic at hand. Joanna Moncrieff doesn't just offer a critique of the current way of looking at things, though. She offers her own, I don't know if it's her own, but in her book she offers another approach towards viewing drugs. So she distinguishes between the disease-centered model and the drug-centered model. The disease-centered model is the one peddled by pharmaceutical corporations, the idea that mental health difficulties are caused by an underlying biological abnormality, and psychiatric drugs balance out this abnormality. As we said, this leads into share prices going up because they're selling loads of drugs. The drug-centered model, meanwhile, which is a whole different way of conceptualizing mental health, or certainly the role of drugs in helping people manage their mental health. This is the idea that psychiatric drugs, rather than actually fixing any underlying abnormality or imbalance, what they do is they cause alterations to the way your brain works and how you experience your emotions, your life in general. It changes your relationship with all of those things. Now, that can have certain positives. If you're in mental health crisis and taking something deadens that crisis a little bit, it might deaden all your other emotions, but it might deaden the urge that you might have to kill yourself, or it might deaden the voices in your head a little bit. It's likely to have downsides. So yeah, emotional numbing, maybe your sex drive completely disappears. There may well be other things as well, but it's all a balancing act in terms of, is this worth a payoff? Is this worth the stuff it'll do? There'll be pros and cons, and it's important to balance these things out. I'm not against the use of drugs in helping people. I've met many people personally and professionally who have been really benefited by psychiatric drugs, so I'm not against them per se. What I'm pointing out here is the massive vested interest in hammering the idea that drugs fix people. But this drug-centered model, which is a lot more measured in my opinion, is not going to be good for the profits of pharmaceutical companies. So they're going to resist this kind of thing. They're not going to like it. Why would they? Why would they promote a model, a way of looking at things that is going to reduce their profit? As we've already talked about, profit is what corporations are there for. If it was an organisation with a single private owner, perhaps, you could argue that it may exist for other reasons. Maybe that owner really does care about supporting people with their mental health problems. With it being a corporation, though, the owners are often relatively detached shareholders that care only really about the price going up of their shares so they can make a profit on their investment. And the people working for the organisation are beholden to these people and those numbers going up. So the corporations, in my opinion, maybe I'm cynical, but corporations generally, what they're actually selling is generally a means to an end of their shares going up. And they're not going to promote a way of understanding mental health which results in their shares going down. The CEO of that corporation is not going to last very long if they say or do anything which is going to result in that. So there's a massive vested interest against these companies acknowledging the more complex relationship between psychiatric drugs and mental health difficulties. It's very much in their interest to hammer the idea that drugs cure mental health difficulties and that mental health difficulties are actually brain abnormalities. I don't think it's a particularly radical notion, the idea that corporations are likely to value profit over anything else. I also don't think it's particularly radical to consider that corporations might use their power to change the entire dialogue about the product they are selling if it suits their interests. And there's numerous examples of this happening in the past. For example, Naomi Oreskes and Eric M. Conway, they are historians of science. They've written a book called Merchants of Doubt, where they give numerous examples of corporations doing exactly this. Now, from a limited point of view, you could say a corporation is selling a particular product. Let's go with tobacco in this example, which is one of the main ones they talk about. They're selling tobacco, they're selling tobacco, they're selling tobacco, and that all is very contained. They advertise tobacco and they sell it as best they can. However, what if a tobacco company, upon realising that tobacco is dangerous, upon realising that people being aware of how dangerous tobacco is would be extremely bad for their organisation? It would be an existential crisis potentially if everyone knew how awful tobacco is and the links to cancer and so on. So what they do, in service of increasing their profit for as long as possible, they'll ruin the ability of the public to have an honest conversation about this topic to keep the money flowing for as long as possible. It's the same with oil organisations, the oil industry in relation to global warming as well. And in this book, these two talk about this in a lot of detail. As I said here, tactics include only publishing research data that favours their own interests, attacking individual researchers that disagree with them, funding think tanks that ostensibly are separate but ultimately are funded by corporations to promote ideas that are favourable to the corporation, and encouraging quote unquote balanced reporting to create the illusion of significant scientific disagreement where none existed. Tobacco apparently was known to be linked to cancer and known to be linked to all kinds of issues back in the 40s. It's known that Hitler apparently refused to be in the same room as someone smoking. It took a long time for everyone to be aware of this though, due to these tactics happening. Now that people are aware of it, it's not going to get put back in the box, and obviously the tobacco industry is in a bit of trouble now, I suppose, because the truth is out there. With all this in mind, I don't think it's beyond the scope of our imagination to consider the possibility that pharmaceutical companies may well be doing the exact same thing. They may well be deliberately disrupting the conversation to serve their own interests. And indeed, James Davis, in his book Sedated, evidences quite clearly how pharmaceutical companies are often doing exactly this. They selectively publish research data on the efficacy of their own drugs to present the idea that their drugs are actually really effective, perhaps more effective than they actually are. We don't know because a lot of the studies they don't show us, basically. Also, with relative opacity, that is, without us knowing exactly what they're doing and why, they can fund influential mental health charities, again, which contribute towards the discourse around this stuff, patient groups, psychiatric research, and leading professional psychiatric organisations, for example, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders itself. If they're publishing this, and if they're funding patient groups, psychiatric research, charities, those people are likely to be slightly beholden to staying on a message that is favourable to these organisations. If your funding is coming from a certain direction, much like the student in my class or me when I was a student in relation to my tutor, if I am beholden to a certain person with particular power, I'm not going to say anything that's going to piss those people off. So charities, research groups, whatever else, are going to be watching what they say if their funding is coming from a particular place. All of this serves the interests of the pharmaceutical companies and not the interests of whatever the truth is. Science doesn't work in the same way as politics. Science, at least in theory, is not interested in how much money you have if the truth, the scientific truth, is at odds with what your interests are. However, as we are seeing, people with lots of money can influence the conversation that we have about all kinds of different topics. Next up, James Davis actually even refers to a UK government report from 2005, the House of Commons Health Select Committee report on the pharmaceutical industry, which reported that the industry markets drugs very aggressively, using misleading information, minimising harms and exaggerating the benefits of those drugs. It also found massive overlap between the pharmaceutical industry and apparently independent medical doctors. Medical doctors that are supposed to be serving patients and patients alone. If there are financial ties to pharmaceutical companies, one might think they have a slight conflict of interest there. If they don't, and if them being financially tied to a pharmaceutical company has absolutely no bearing on how they behave and what they do, then one must wonder why they even have that tie in the first place. What service is being offered there if they are not doing anything whatsoever in return for these financial benefits? The report concluded that the regulatory agency, now the MHRA, had become too close to the industry with common policy objectives, agreed processes, frequent contact, consultation and interchange of staff between the MHRA, the professional body for healthcare in the UK, and the pharmaceutical industry. If there's overlap there, you've got to wonder how much the truth of things is compromised in the service of these corporate interests. If there was no benefit for the corporations to do this, then they would not do it. So I think something's getting compromised if there is this overlap. The report, in any case, called for the overhaul of the regulatory system to ensure that the health industry works in the public interest and not in corporate interests. But no such reforms have taken place since the report was published. Final note on this example is that, of course, some people do find drugs helpful. As I said before, I'm not categorically against the use of drugs in supporting people with difficulties with their mental health. I am talking about things that are getting in the way of us all being able to have an honest conversation about this. As Davis points out, over 20% of the UK adult population takes a psychiatric drug in any particular year. And if you look at those stats and the likelihood that it's going to increase in the future, alongside the scientific evidence for the efficacy of those drugs, I'm not sure if how often they're used is explained purely in terms of how good they are. I think there are other interests at play here, and I would say these massive vested interests that I've talked about are having a massive influence on how we're supporting people with their mental health difficulties.